The British Empire was once described as the empire where the sun never set. But there is another way to understand it. Not as a land lit by daylight, but as a machine that never slept. When night fell in London, morning rose in India. When dusk came to Africa, midday burned across Australia. When factories closed in Manchester, plantations worked through the night in the Caribbean. Somewhere, at every hour, a ship was sailing, a port was loading, a soldier was marching, a clerk was writing, or a courtroom was deciding the fate of a colony. The empire did not rest. The world moved so it could move. This is the story of the empire that never slept. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for giving your time to explore history with me. Today, we look at the British Empire not just as territory, but as a system in constant motion. An empire of ships and trade. An empire of laws and letters. An empire of railways, ports, soldiers, teachers, sailors, merchants, and clerks. From sunrise in Asia to sunset in the Caribbean, it worked like a heartbeat stretching across oceans. Before we begin, here is a question for you. Do you think the British Empire succeeded because of its power, or because it never allowed itself to stop working? Let me know what you think, as the journey begins. At the dawn of the 18th century, Britain stood on the edge of something larger than itself. It was not yet a global superpower. It did not command the seas with certainty or guide world affairs with authority. But the pieces of a future empire were already in motion. Trade routes expanded. Ships departed before sunrise. Goods crossed oceans with the rhythm of tides. The empire, in its earliest form, depended on motion. No pause. No rest. In London, Bristol, and Liverpool, the day started before the light reached the horizon. Lanterns flickered along docks as merchants checked manifests and sailors loaded cargo. The smell of salt, rope, and wet timber filled the morning air. Ships bound for the Caribbean waited for favorable winds. Others prepared for the long crossing to North America. The decks creaked. The water slapped against the hulls. This was not yet the machinery of empire, but it was the sound of one being built. Trade was the first engine of expansion. British ports connected to distant markets more frequently with each passing year. Sugar, timber, tobacco, and textiles moved through warehouses, passed from hand to hand, and climbed in value with every mile traveled. These goods represented more than commerce. They represented access, influence, possibility. Britain did not yet rule these routes, but it benefited from them. Every successful voyage strengthened the belief that the Islanda's future lay beyond its shores. Across the Atlantic, British settlements in the Caribbean and North America grew at different speeds. Some were thriving towns with markets and ports. Others were struggling outposts, dependent on supply ships to survive. Even in their vulnerability, these places tied Britain to distant lands. They created relationships that needed protection. They established claims that needed defense. They pulled the kingdom outward, step by step, into a world where movement was everything. Back home, people learned to think beyond the island. News of foreign markets and unfamiliar coastlines filtered into taverns and coffeehouses. Maps on walls became more detailed each year. Merchants spoke confidently about regions they had never seen. Ordinary citizens heard new names and imagined futures that stretched past the Channel and into the open sea. Britain no longer felt contained by its borders. It began to think of itself in relation to the world. Identity began to shift. Britain no longer felt contained by its borders. It began to think of itself in relation to the world. Identity began to shift. Britain thinks beyond its island. News of foreign markets and unfamiliar coastlines filtered into taverns and coffeehouses. Merchants spoke confidently about regions they had never seen. Ordinary citizens heard new names and imagined futures that stretched past the Channel and into the open sea. Britain no longer felt contained by its borders. It began to think of itself in relation to the world. Identity began to shift. Britain thinks beyond its island. News of foreign markets and unfamiliar coastlines filtered into taverns and coffeehouses. Merchants spoke confidently about regions they had never seen. Ordinary citizens heard new names and imagined futures that stretched past the Channel and into the open sea. Britain no longer felt contained by its borders. It began to think of itself in relation to the world. Identity began to shift. Naval strength remained limited, but it was growing. Shipyards produced vessels built not just for travel, but for protection. Warships escorted convoys along dangerous routes. Rival European powers contested control of waters that connected continents. Britain could not yet guarantee safety, but it could test its reach. Every voyage was a risk. Every return was a lesson. The process was gradual, built on experience rather than confidence. In warehouses and counting houses, paper became a tool of expansion. Records, contracts, and accounts defined ownership, profit, and obligation. Commerce created expectations. Those expectations required structure. Without knowing it, Britain was laying the administrative groundwork for a future empire. Decisions made at desks would influence events that took place thousands of miles away. Trade routes shaped policy before policy shaped territory. For sailors and laborers, the empire did not feel like an idea. It felt like work. Loading crates at dawn. Repairing sails in the cold. Watching coastlines disappear as ships pulled away from home. The global system relied on people who did not benefit from it equally. Their efforts powered the early engines of commerce. Their labor kept ships moving. The Caribbean and North American trade became the lifeline of this early system. Ships left with manufactured goods and returned with products valued in Britannia's markets. The cycle of exchange accelerated. The Islanda's economy began to depend on these routes. The more Britain traded, the more it needed to protect what it gained. Expansion created responsibility. Responsibility created strategy. By the end of the decade, patterns were forming. The kingdom continued to move outward. Influence traveled with every hull that cut through the Atlantic. Each voyage made the next one easier to imagine. Momentum built slowly, but with purpose. Britain was not yet an empire of dominion. It was an empire of direction. Forward. Outward. Toward opportunity that always seemed just beyond the horizon. The dawn of 1700 reveals a world in transition. The power that Britain would later claim did not appear fully formed. From repetition. From motion. From the belief that the future could be reached by ship. The empire was not yet an empire. It was a network of ambitions tied together by wind and water. It relied on constant travel because standing still meant losing ground. Looking back, this moment shows how an empire begins long before it is recognized. In ports before palaces. In docks before declarations. In the work of ordinary people before the decisions of governments. The year 1700 stands as the threshold. A kingdom, not yet powerful, but already moving. A nation not yet dominant, but already imagining something greater. Dawn on the empire did not break suddenly. It arrived like the morning light on the water. Quiet. Steady. Expanding. The shipping clock 1760 to 1800. By the late 18th century, the British Empire ticked like a clock across the sea. Wind, tide, and human labor became its gears. Trade routes formed the hands that swept across oceans, marking time not in minutes but in voyages. Ships creaked away from European ports with the precision of departure schedules, their hulls filled with manufactured goods. They carried cloth, tools, weapons, and barrels sealed for travel. These vessels did not simply move cargo. They carried expectations. Their movement kept the empire alive. The first stage of the journey pushed south along the Atlantic coast. Sailors adjusted rigging and canvas to capture every gust. The ocean dictated speed, but the empire dictated purpose. The ships crossed open water, leaving behind the smell of coal smoke and entering the world of salt air and distant horizons. Each mile traveled linked Europe to markets across the world, creating a chain that could not be seen but could always be felt. With the wind at their backs, the ships reached Africa. Goods from Britain came ashore, and cargo was exchanged. Some returned to the ships willingly. Others did not. The Atlantic system relied on this stage to fuel the plantations across the ocean. The clock's gears turned, and the next segment of the journey began. To the empire, the schedule mattered more than the cost. It demanded consistency, regardless of consequence. The Middle Passage pushed westward across the ocean. The wind no longer felt like freedom. It became pressure. Captains drove their ships onward. Racing weather, disease, and time. The sea offered no pause. Storms and heat tested sailors and captives alike. This journey existed in the spaces between charts, spaces marked by risk, hope, and loss. The empire measured these crossings not in suffering, but in profit. The clock continued to turn. When the ships reached plantation colonies in the Caribbean or the Americas, the next stage of the cycle began. Sugarcane fields stretched across the land, their rows sharp beneath the sun. Tobacco crops dried in barns. Rum production filled the air with the smell of molasses and smoke. The empire treated them as essential machinery, maintaining them through force, regulation, and endless routine. Ports worked long after sunset. Lanterns flickered on docks as barrels were rolled aboard. Torches glowed beside weighing scales. The sound of rope slapping against wood echoed through the night. Dockworkers loaded crates of sugar, tobacco, and cotton onto waiting vessels. Scribes tracked inventory by candlelight, their ink smudging as the sea breeze caught the pages. Account books filled with numbers that measured the empire's reach. The work rarely stopped. The night shift became as important as the day. By dawn, another ship would depart. Sailors hauled anchor. Officers called orders against the wind. The cycle repeated. Sugar and tobacco sailed back toward Britain. The ships retraced the route they had taken months before. Each movement a confirmation that the system held together. The empire had become a schedule. The ocean had become a timetable. Profit had become a pulse. When these vessels reached Britain, the sugar poured into warehouses, eventually finding its way into kitchens and tea. Tobacco arrived in crates and traveled. Cotton and other raw materials fed. The goods that returned completed the ocean erased the stages that. The schedule looked clean because distance. Port cities grew wealthier. Banking houses expanded to manage investment. Insurance companies developed tools to protect ships and cargo. Dockside taverns filled with sailors trading stories of calm seas and violent storms. Shipyards hammered new hulls into shape, preparing the next fleet to join the rotation. The shipping clock kept ticking, and Britannia's economy synchronized itself with every turn. Even those who never boarded a ship lived by this timetable. Shopkeepers planned orders around arrivals. Families purchased tea, sugar, and tobacco without realizing they were purchasing the results of a system in motion. Newspapers tracked ship schedules and reported arrivals like weather reports. The empire's rhythm entered daily life. People woke, worked, and ate in a world shaped by transoceanic timing. Technology supported the schedule. Better charts improved navigation. Stronger hulls resisted storms. Naval escorts protected merchant routes when conflict threatened. These advancements made the system feel stable, even when the sea beneath it remained unpredictable. The clock appeared reliable, but its gears were fragile. A storm, a rebellion, a diplomatic dispute any could disrupt the timing. Yet the empire pushed forward, believing movement itself ensured security. By 1800, the shipping clock defined Britannia's relationship with the world. It created wealth that reshaped cities, built country houses, and funded political influence. It fueled industries that transformed landscapes. It linked lives across continents even when those lives never touched. The empire was not only defended by armies. It was maintained by timetables, cargo manifests, and the hands of sailors who set rigging in the dark. This system reveals how trade can become identity. How schedules can become destiny. How movement across water can determine the future of nations. The British Empire became more than territory. It became a cycle made real through repetition. A network of ports and plantations that never slept. A structure powered by wind, ambition, and the turning of the clock across the sea. In those decades, time itself seemed to move with the ships. The rise and fall of sails marked the hours. The loading of cargo marked the days. The return of vessels marked the seasons. The empire operated not only on maps, but on the rhythm of journeys that connected continents. And in that rhythm, Britain built a world that depended on movement more than rest. The shipping clock kept turning. And the empire turned with it. The Indian Engine 1757 to 1830. In 1757, the Battle of Plassey marked a turning point that would reshape both Britain and India. The East India Company, once a trading corporation with ambitions, became a governing power with authority. Bengal, a region with rich agriculture, skilled production, and commercial networks older than any European company, fell under its control. What began as a victory on a battlefield became the foundation of an economic engine. From this moment forward, India was no longer only a source of goods. It became the financial heart of expansion. The Compania's presence in Bengal turned trade into administration and administration into revenue. Taxes flowed through systems reorganized to favor imperial needs. Records filled offices with ledgers that tracked grain, textiles, and land assessments. Clerks counted crops and profits with the same precision that commanders once counted troops. What had been a commercial partnership became an extraction network. The company collected wealth not only through goods, but through governance. Cotton moved from Indian fields to British factories. Opium traveled along trade routes toward China. Finished textiles, once a famous product of Indian craftsmanship, were gradually replaced by machine-made cloth from industrial Britain. These shifts did not happen overnight, but they built a pattern. Production, trade, and profit no longer served local markets first. They served the needs of expansion. The Indian economy became part of a machine that operated from London, Liverpool, and Manchester. In Calcutta, clerks filled long tables with ink and paper. They worked through humid nights while London slept. Decisions made on British desks shaped the rhythms of Indian cities. Rates of taxation, shipping schedules, and trade regulations flowed across continents through letters and sealed packets. A merchant in London might never see the land that produced his wealth, but the accounting matched the distance. India and Britain were separated by thousands of miles, yet joined by columns of numbers. Banks in London grew stronger as the Compania's revenue increased. Investors gained influence. Loans were issued to fund ships, military campaigns, and further expansion. Profits from India supported factories that fed the Industrial Revolution. A loom in Manchester was part of the same system as a tax office in Bengal. A ledger in Calcutta shaped the price of goods in British shops. The empire did not operate through force alone. It operated through finance. The Compania's rule was not solely economic. It relied on alliances with local leaders, networks of officials, and new legal codes. Indian administrators worked within the system, often balancing their own interests with the demands placed upon them. The structure that developed was complex. It was not simply British over India. It was a collaboration shaped by pressure, opportunity, and adaptation. Decisions made in London affected the smallest market towns. Decisions made in Calcutta influenced imperial policy. The two worlds were bound together, but not equally. For ordinary people, the effects were uneven. Some prospered under new contracts, new trade, or new roles in the administration. Others faced heavier burdens of tax or shifts in land ownership that restricted what had once been familiar rights. The change was not only economic. It was social. It reached into daily life. It altered the price of food, the rhythm of harvests, and the value of work. A decision written in one city could echo across a village on the other side of the subcontinent. By the early 19th century, India had become more than a territory. It had become a system. The empire depended on it. The Compania's presence supported armies that expanded British control. It secured ports and negotiated treaties. It funded roads, trade centers, and administrative buildings that made authority visible. These developments allowed Britain to present its rule as organized and modern, even when the foundation of that rule was uneven and contested. Connections between Britain and India deepened further as communication improved. Faster ships reduced travel time. Messages crossed oceans with greater regularity. Information began to flow in both directions. Traders in Britain learned to rely on updates from Bengal. Officials in Calcutta waited for policy instructions from London. The relationship resembled a balance of daylight and darkness. Calcutta worked while London slept. London made decisions while India dreamed. This relationship created a new kind of imperial identity. The empire was no longer defined only by exploration or conquest. It was defined by management. Authority existed in ledgers as much as in forts. The empire's strength came not just from weapons, but from contracts, tariffs, and the ability to calculate profit across oceans. It was an empire of arithmetic as much as geography. As the 1820s approached, the scale of this system became undeniable. The East India Company presided over territories larger than many European kingdoms. Revenue from India influenced British budgets. Military decisions in South Asia shaped foreign policy in Europe. The empire's future growth, imagined by the government and investors, relied on the continuation of the Indian engine. It provided the fuel for ambition. But within the system, questions formed. How long could a trade company rule a land as complex as India? How much could be administered from afar? What happened when financial strategy and local need collided? These questions did not yet break the structure, but they foreshadowed the tensions that would define later decades. The engine was powerful, but it was not silent. It produced wealth and pressure at the same time. Between 1757 and 1830, Britain and India became bound together through trade, taxation, administration, and ambition. The connection was not built on partnership, but on structure. It created prosperity for some and hardship for others. It powered factories in Britain and altered economies in India. It ran on ink, calculation, and long-distance command. Two worlds linked by ledgers and decisions. The Indian engine did not rely on steam or coal. It relied on control. It shaped the empire and prepared the ground for what would come next. In 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar changed the course of history. On rough waters off the coast of Spain, fleets collided in thunderous combat. When the smoke cleared and the cannons fell silent, Britain emerged with command of the sea. This victory did not simply defeat an enemy. It redrew the balance of global power. From that moment onward, the Royal Navy became the heartbeat of the empire, a force that never slept and never stopped moving. The sea turned into a highway of influence. Ships under the Union Jack guarded trade routes that stretched across oceans. They protected merchant vessels carrying goods to and from distant ports. They watched coastlines, enforced blockades, and deterred rivals. Their presence was constant, even when unseen. Somewhere beneath the horizon, sails were rising or steam was churning. The empire's reach depended on this vigilance. Without the navy, its economy and communication would collapse like a broken bridge. Life aboard these ships demanded endurance. Sailors stood watch in storms that tore across the waves. With wind howling like an animal in the rigging. Nights passed in uneasy silence, broken only by the creak of timber and the crash of water against the hull. The crew worked in shifts, sleeping in narrow hammocks and waking to resume tasks that never truly ended. On deck, officers scanned for distant shapes, measuring risk with every change of weather. The ship was a world unto itself, carrying not just men, but responsibility. The sea became the empire's backbone. It linked islands to continents, colonies to capitals, and markets to manufacturers. Trade was not a simple exchange of goods. It was a chain of trust that required protection. Cotton, tea, spices, timber, and metals moved through these routes, and every shipment relied on the navy to reach its destination. Sailors did not see the full impact of their work, but they felt its weight. Their duty existed in the space between danger and stability. Even in calm waters, the threat of conflict lingered. Rival fleets tested boundaries. Privateers prowled shipping lanes. Storms could wreck a vessel as completely as enemy cannon fire. A single miscalculation could send a ship to the bottom. This constant risk made the Navia's quiet hours just as important as its battles. Peace on the surface was possible only because effort continued below it. Ports across Britain reflected the scale of this mission. Ropewalks twisted fiber into miles of rigging. Foundries cast anchors and cannon. Dockside warehouses overflowed with supplies. These coastal towns became the living gears of a machine that stretched around the world. Their labor kept the fleets moving, turning sweat and steel into security. The Navy also shaped international perception. Other nations watched Britain's ships and understood the message. Control of the sea was control of communication, transport, and war. Britain could respond to threats faster than rivals. It could send reinforcements across oceans, supply distant garrisons, and influence political decisions without firing a shot. Diplomacy gained force because the fleet existed behind it. For the sailors themselves, identity formed around endurance. Home was not a place, but a memory. Months could pass before a crew saw land. Letters traveled slowly. News arrived late. Yet these men carried Britain with them in their work and discipline. They were ordinary individuals performing extraordinary roles, keeping the empire connected through their vigilance. Weather shaped their world. Fog could hide coastlines. Ice could seize rigging. Heat could turn decks into furnaces. Heat could turn decks into furnaces. Every climate tested them. Their journey might take them from the cold waters of the North Atlantic to the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean. Across each horizon, the demands of their mission remained the same. Guard the lanes. Protect the ships. Keep the Empire's pulse steady. In 1805, Trafalgar secured naval dominance. But dominance required maintenance. It was not a trophy. It was a responsibility that demanded continuous effort. Every successful voyage, every convoy escorted, every storm endured sustained the structure of the empire. The world had changed, and the navy had to match it with constant motion. Even when Britain was at peace, the ships remained at sea. Time turned the ocean into a theater of presence rather than conquest. The navy did not need to fight to prove its influence. Its existence alone shaped outcomes. Decisions made in foreign courts, negotiations conducted in colonial capitals, and trade agreements signed in distant ports were all affected by the knowledge that British ships could arrive if needed. As years passed, the legacy of 1805 became more than a historic victory. It became a foundation upon which the 19th century was built. Steam engines replaced sails. Iron hulls replaced wood. Technology evolved, but the purpose remained unchanged. Protect the network. Secure the sea. Preserve the lines that held the empire together. Every hour, somewhere, a British ship cut through the waves. It might be escorting a convoy through dangerous waters. It might be patrolling a coast where tension simmered. It might be carrying messages, supplies, or families returning home. The movement was endless. It was the quiet, relentless work that allowed the empire to function. In the end, the navy was more than a military force. A symbol of connection that stretched beyond borders. A reminder that the stability of a global system depended on the people who labored in isolation. Under starlit skies or raging storms, unseen but essential. This was the empire's pulse. A heartbeat made of sailcloth, steam, cannon, and determination. A rhythm that began in 1805. And continued as long as the sea carried British ships toward the horizon. Factories and the midnight mills 1830 to 1860. Between 1830 and 1860, the Industrial Revolution transformed Britain into a world of furnaces, chimneys, and restless machinery. Towns that had once slept beneath the quiet rhythm of sunrise and sunset now pulsed with the relentless beat of factory whistles. Coal fires burned long into the night. Steam engines rattled windows in homes nearby. Smoke drifted above rooftops like a second sky. The old world lived by daylight. The new world worked until exhaustion, measured not by sunlight but by the clock. Inside the mills, cotton from India and Egypt spun through metal frames and whirring spindles. Fibers became thread. Thread became cloth. Cloth became profit. The raw material traveled thousands of miles before reaching the hands of the workers who fed it into machines. Most had never seen the lands where the cotton grew. They knew only the feel of it, the weight of it, and the sound of the machinery that twisted it into something new. And the sound of the machinery that twisted it into something new. Their labor turned distant harvests into British industry. Sugar from the Caribbean sweetened tea in working homes. It arrived in crates and barrels, labeled with ports that seemed like fragments of another world. A teaspoon stirred into a cup carried a history most families did not speak about. For them, the taste meant comfort. It meant pause after a long shift. It meant a moment of stillness before sleep. They did not see the plantations where it was grown. They saw only the table before them, the steam rising, and the world they tried to endure. Railways carved across the landscape like veins of iron. Steam locomotives pulled carriages filled with goods toward ports without pause. Factories did not wait for rest or weather. Production moved on schedule, and the trains matched it. Coal carts rolled into loading bays. Cotton traveled inland. Finished cloth traveled out. Every track connected a mill to a harbor to a ship, and a ship to a trade route. The empire moved in steel and smoke. Workers lived by the factory whistle, not the rising sun. It signaled the start of the day. It signaled the end of it. It dictated breaks, meals, and the rhythm of survival. Some workers stepped into the night and returned to it. Sleep came not with the setting of the sun, but whenever hours of labor allowed. The body learned to ignore the clock. The clock did not ignore the body. Night shifts became a world of their own. Lamps flickered. Machinery glowed with reflected heat. Shadows bent across metal beams and conveyor belts. Conversation stayed low, often drowned out by the roar of the looms. Workers measured time through repetition, not through moments. Tasks repeated until they became instinct. Even breathing seemed to fall in rhythm with the machines. Children worked alongside adults in many factories. Small hands cleared threads from machinery. Young eyes strained to follow supervisors' instructions. Their education came not from books, but from the demands of industry. Childhood blended with labor, not leisure. Families depended on their wages. Mills depended on their endurance. Reform would eventually change these conditions, but during these decades, children carried their share of the weight. British nights powered colonial days. While mills operated through darkness. Ships crossed oceans toward markets that waited for their cargo. Goods produced in the quiet hours of Lancashire or Yorkshire arrived weeks later in overseas ports. Dawn rose somewhere else as factories continued to run. The empire did not sleep as a single unit. It rotated through time zones like gears in a global machine. Production became the unspoken bond that tied distant places together. It rotated through time zones like gears in a global machine. Inside the mills, the air filled with dust. Fibers clung to clothing and hair. Workers coughed through the shifts. But the machines did not stop. Supervisors timed breaks, inspected output, and recorded numbers on ledgers. Profit was measured by the minute. Efficiency became a language. Workers adapted to survive it. Silence and resilience became forms of communication when words were lost behind noise. Outside the mills, life continued with worn edges. Streets near factories filled with coal dust. And the scent of burning fuel. Narrow houses crowded together, built quickly to accommodate growing populations. Families cooked simple meals, often stretching ingredients to last through the week. Leisure, when it existed, came in brief moments. A quiet evening. A prayer before bed. A mug of tea sweetened with sugar. That connected them to another part of the world without their knowing. In these decades, identity shifted. Britain no longer saw itself only as a nation of countryside and trade. It became a nation of production. A nation of machinery and output. Pride and hardship lived side by side. Some saw the factories as proof of progress. Others saw them as cages built from opportunity and dependence. No one could deny the change. It echoed from mill to mill, from town to town. Until the landscape itself seemed built from iron and ambition. By 1860, the midnight mills had become symbols of a new age. Represented transformation, both visible and invisible. They shaped cities, economies, and the rhythm of ordinary lives. They created wealth in some places and exhaustion in others. They connected Britain to distant lands in ways few understood. They turned raw materials into an empire of production. Factories changed Britain. But they changed the world alongside it. Behind every finished bolt of cloth was a story of steam engines and coal fires. Of workers who labored through night hours, and of materials that began their journey far beyond British shores. The Industrial Revolution did not end at the factory gate. It continued in the ports, the markets, the ships, and the colonies connected to them. In the quiet hours before dawn, when machinery slowed and workers stumbled toward rest, the mills stood like monuments to transformation. They were built from steel, smoke, and the hope that tomorrow would be better than today. And in those hopes, the next chapter of Britannia's industrial world began. Under Queen Victoria, from 1837 to 1901, the British Empire changed from scattered territories into a connected system. It became a web that stretched across oceans, deserts, jungles, and mountain ranges. It relied on constant movement, constant communication, and constant attention. Soldiers guarded borders. Missionaries taught lessons. Administrators wrote laws. Even when the Queen slept in her palace, the empire did not. This network began with communication. Telegraph lines carrying instructions that once would have taken weeks by ship. Now a sentence could travel from London to distant capitals in minutes. Decisions made in government offices echoed across the empire like a signal traveling down a wire. Orders, corrections, and approvals moved faster than armies or trade. In this speed, Britain found a new kind of power, the power to respond before rivals acted. Postal routes expanded the web further. Steamships delivered mail on predictable schedules. Sorting offices in port cities handled bags of letters. Written by officials, merchants, soldiers, and families. Messages of business, instruction, and home traveled side by side. The postal system became both practical infrastructure and emotional thread. It allowed people separated by oceans to feel connected, even when distance remained unchanged. Across the empire, administrators served as the framework of authority. They wrote laws, managed budgets, and processed reports. Communicating with London was crucial to their role. Their work shaped how territories were governed. They did not rule alone. But they translated imperial expectations into daily regulation. Offices became centers of decision-making. Paperwork became a form of control. Files and signatures carried as much influence as soldiers and cannons. In this way, bureaucracy became a quiet force. Along borders and frontiers, soldiers performed a different task. They guarded positions where laws met resistance or uncertainty. Forts stood at the edges of deserts and forests. Patrols watched river crossings and passes. Some regiments served in places far from home for years at a time. Their presence signals that the empire is not only written on maps. It was held in place. Missionaries contributed to the web through education and belief. They founded schools, translated religious texts, and taught new systems of thought. Their work intersected with local cultures in ways that could change identity and tradition. In some places they were welcomed. In others they were challenged. But everywhere they went, their influence formed another thread in the network. A thread tied to values, language, and worldview. Trade routes wove the web together economically. Goods flowed toward Britain from colonies that supplied resources, crops, and raw materials. Manufactured products flowed outward from British factories. Ports became gateways where these exchanges repeated constantly. Dockworkers, merchants, sailors, and clerks each held a small piece of the system. They did not see the whole structure, but they felt its pull. Every transaction was part of a chain that reached beyond the horizon. The empire's web depended on motion. Steam locomotives crossed continents. River steamers pushed inland to supply remote stations. Railways stretched from coasts to interior capitals, linking towns that had never before been connected. Each new route changed trade, settlement, and authority. Movement allowed decisions made in distant offices to reach the ground. Without motion, the web would collapse. Inside Britain itself, the empire's presence was visible. Newspapers published updates from around the world, blending information with national pride. Museums displayed artifacts as symbols of reach and curiosity. It became not just administration or territory. It became identity. A story a nation told itself about its purpose and place in the world. Yet beneath the confidence, the web was stretched and strained. Communication could not erase disagreement. Control could not remove resistance. Local demands challenged imperial policy. Communities adapted to the network or pushed against it. In some regions, alliances formed to preserve autonomy. In others, conflict revealed the limits of the system. The empire functioned through effort rather than inevitability. Despite these tensions, the network endured. Reports arrived on predictable dates. Inspections followed fixed schedules. Trade shipments matched seasonal patterns. This rhythm created the illusion of permanence. But it also hid the work required to maintain it. The web continued because countless people continued to sustain it. By the end of Victoria's reign, the empire reached its peak in territory, communication, and confidence. Lines on maps marked borders claimed in distant negotiations. Telegraph poles cast shadows across desert roads. Steamships crowded ports from Cape Town to Calcutta. The network was both impressive and fragile. It appeared solid, yet it relied on constant motion to survive. If the lines stopped moving, the structure would weaken. Looking back, the Victorian era shows that empires are not held together only by strength. They are held together by connection. By messages, laws, soldiers, ships, and belief. The Victorian web was the empire's nervous system. It carried instructions, pressure, and expectation across thousands of miles. It made the world feel smaller to those who commanded it and larger to those who lived within it. Under Queen Victoria, the empire became a network that never slept. It moved while the cities dreamed. It stretched while the Queen rested. It continued through the night, across oceans and frontiers, through wires, and along rails. It breathed through motion, and as long as it kept moving, the web held. Even when the lamps in the palace were dark, the empire remained awake. Midnight in Africa 1880 to 1914. Between 1880 and 1914, a silence settled over the African continent that was not truly silence at all. In cities, villages, and desert regions, people slept beneath the stars or worked through the night by lantern glow. But far away, in offices thousands of miles from the land those people lived on, decisions were being made that would reshape their futures. This period, later called the Scramble for Africa, became an era defined by distance, ambition, and darkness. Not only the darkness of night, but the darkness of uncertainty. In London, the lights inside government departments and company boardrooms often stayed on long after the city streets fell quiet. Maps lay stretched across tables. Pens moved through candlelight and lamplight, carving new borders on paper as though they had the authority to carve borders into the earth. Clerks sorted documents while telegraph operators tapped out messages that echoed across continents. Midnight became the hour when empires planned. Time became a resource as valuable as gold or land. These offices were not isolated. Similar scenes unfolded in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels. European officials studied charts drawn from explorers' journals, not always understanding the landscapes they described. They drafted proposals and treaties, assigning rivers as borders and dividing territories with straight lines that did not follow the shape of mountains, forests, or ethnic boundaries. Decisions made in one time zone drifted into another, like shadows crossing the world while most slept. Daylight in Africa often began beneath borders that had changed overnight. Meanwhile, in Africa itself, midnight looked very different. The continent did not sleep in stillness. Mines glowed with torchlight as workers continued through the dark to meet production quotas. Machinery clattered through the night inside industrial compounds. Railway construction crews kept working by lantern to stay ahead of schedules demanded from overseas. Ports did not fully rest. Cranes creaked over the water, and steam engines hissed in the distance. The empire wanted extraction, and extraction did not stop for nightfall. The time difference between continents created an unnatural rhythm. A town might wake to news that it now fell under a different administration. Leaders might receive letters bearing decisions already finalized. Those who lived with the consequences rarely knew when or why the decisions had been made. Those who made decisions rarely stood on the land. Their choices affected those who lived with the consequences rarely knew when or why the decisions had been made. Those who made decisions rarely stood on the land. Their choices affected those who lived with the consequences rarely knew when or why the decisions had been made. Those who made decisions rarely stood on the land. Their choices affected those who lived with. Telegraph lines intensified this pace. Messages traveled faster than ships ever could. Instructions leapt from capital to colony and back again. Even as night blanketed one continent, the wheels of industry continued to turn in another. The loop fed itself. The machinery of expansion depended on coordination. Mining companies demanded night shifts to meet the timetables of foreign markets. Railways operated to deliver ore, rubber, and ivory before the next ship arrived. Administrators held nighttime meetings to report quotas, tax collection, and labor conditions. The empire did not rest. It measured time by output, not sunrise. But within this relentless motion existed human lives that moved at a different pace. Farmers who did not know their land had been promised to another power continued planting crops. Traders who crossed borders by tradition discovered those borders no longer existed. Families awoke to unfamiliar flags raised above government buildings. Midnight in Africa had rewritten the morning without consultation. The new borders drawn in faraway conference rooms rarely matched the realities of language, culture, or community on the ground. Straight lines cut across regions that had developed identities over centuries. Rivers that once connected villages now divided them. Nomadic paths turned into restricted zones. Some rulers signed treaties under pressure, believing they were engaging in negotiation. Others never learned their lands had been claimed on paper until enforcement arrived in uniform. In Europe, these partitions were described as order. In Africa, they felt like interruption. The rhythm of life, shaped by seasons and trade routes, collided with the rhythm of imperial schedules. The imbalance of time created the imbalance of power. Decisions rushed across oceans faster than resistance could organize against them. Still, even within this imposed structure, African leaders, workers, and communities found ways to adapt, negotiate, and resist. Some sought diplomatic solutions. Some used slow and subtle methods of refusal. Others worked within the systems imposed upon them to maintain what identity they could. Midnight planning in Europe could change lines on a map. But it could not erase the lives beneath them. The land remained older than any treaty. The people remained older than any border. The gap between the planning rooms and the continent widened as the years passed. Railways advanced deeper inland. Ports expanded. Mines reached new depths. Midnight became the symbolic hour when fate was written without those who would live it. Days in Africa became shaped by nights in Europe, as though the sun itself followed imperial instruction. By 1914, the clockwork of the scramble for Africa appeared complete on paper. Borders were drawn. Administrations were installed. Resources were locked into systems of extraction. The continent had been organized for the benefit of others, not the people who called it home. Midnight decisions could not hold forever against daylight realities. This is the story of a world divided by time. A world where distance created authority. A world where day and night existed in conflict. Midnight in Africa meant motion in Europe. Motion in Europe meant change in Africa. And in that loop of decisions and consequences, the shape of the 20th century began to form. The scramble for Africa was not only a race for territory. It was a race against time. A race run across oceans. A race measured in treaties drafted under lamplight and borders drawn while most of the continent slept. Midnight was the hour when empires wrote the future. World War and the Tired Empire 1914 to 1918. When the First World War began in 1914, the British Empire entered the conflict with confidence. But also with a weight it did not fully recognize. The empire stretched across the world. Held together by trade, administration, and the belief that it was too large to fail. Yet the war did not ask whether the empire was powerful. It asked whether the empire could endure. And across 4 years of fighting, sacrifice, and strain, endurance became the true measure of strength. From the earliest days of the war, troops from across the empire traveled thousands of miles to join the front lines. India sent soldiers who marched into unfamiliar winters. African regiments served in campaigns on multiple continents. Men from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand boarded ships for Europe, committed to a struggle that reached far beyond their own shores. Volunteers from the Caribbean trained beside British regiments, forming battalions that would be tested in some of the harshest battles of the war. The empire did not stand behind Britain. It stood with it. Factories became as crucial as battlefields. In London, Manchester, Glasgow, and Birmingham, machines ran through day and night. Steam and sweat fed the production of rifles, artillery, and ammunition. The empire's strength was measured not only in soldiers, but in output. The war consumed everything. Metal, coal, labor, and energy all flowed toward one purpose. Hospitals filled. Casualty lists appeared in newspapers with numbing frequency. Medical ships crossed the channel carrying wounded soldiers back to Britain. Nurses worked in wards that overflowed with stretchers. For many families, war arrived not as distant headlines, but as telegrams delivered to their doorsteps. In every corner of the empire, from London streets to Indian villages, from Canadian towns to Caribbean ports, people waited for news that could change their lives in a single sentence. Communication became a lifeline. Telegram machines clicked without rest, sending orders, reports, and requests for reinforcements. War rooms glowed with lamplight long after midnight. Messages moved faster than ever before, but never fast enough to stay ahead of the anxiety they carried. Officers at the front relied on information that could shift by the hour. Ministers in London made decisions shaped by battlefield maps scattered across polished desks. The empire was connected by cables and signals, but connection did not mean relief. It meant responsibility. By 1916, exhaustion was visible. The war had become a struggle of attrition. The empire's resources, though vast, began to feel finite. Food shortages spread through the civilian population. Coal reserves strained under the demand of factories and ships. Every new offensive required more than the one before. More men. More weapons. More resolve. The empire was still standing, but it was breathing harder with each passing month. The emotional strain deepened as the war continued. Many believed that victory would come quickly. Instead, years passed. Seasons changed. Lives were altered. The empire that had once projected certainty now existed in a world defined by uncertainty. Newspapers tried to maintain morale. But the shadow of loss reached too far to be ignored. On the Western Front. Trenches filled with mud and fear. In the Middle East and Africa. New fronts opened. Stretching the empire further. Each campaign added weight to a structure already under pressure. Yet even under strain, the empire achieved moments of resilience. Colonial troops fought with determination. Engineers built roads, railways, and medical stations essential to survival. Ships guarded supply lines that kept armies alive. Every act of service, every factory shift, every night spent in a command room added another thread to the fabric holding the empire together. It did not break, but the effort to keep it from breaking became its own kind of battle. As 1918 approached, the war turned. The arrival of new allies and shifting strategies changed the balance. The empire pushed forward, but victory felt different than the triumphs of earlier decades. It was not a celebration born of glory. It was a breath of relief taken by a world that had reached its limit. London rang bells to mark the end of fighting, but the sound carried a note of weariness. Victory had come, but at a price that could not be ignored. When the war ended, the empire stood. It had survived, but it had aged. The confidence of 1914 no longer matched the reality of 1918. The empire had seen what endurance required. It had seen how much strain its institutions, its people, and its identity could bear. Even triumph could not erase the exhaustion. Many who had fought or worked through the war hoped that the sacrifice would bring change. They wondered if the empire could remain the same after what it had demanded of them. For the soldiers who returned home, the world felt altered. Some found their communities waiting for them. Others returned to economies struggling to rebuild. Veterans from across the empire carried memories of battlefields and hospitals into civilian life. They did not forget what the war had taken. And in that memory, questions began to form about loyalty, recognition, and the future. Between 1914 and 1918, the British Empire proved it could endure. But endurance came with cost. The war showed not only the reach of the empire, but its limits. It revealed strength, and it revealed strain. Even in victory, the empire felt tired. The foundations remained, but the weight upon them was heavier than before. The war had been won. But the world that emerged from it would never be the same. Between 1919 and 1947, the British Empire moved like a machine that had lost its balance. The First World War had pushed it to the edge of exhaustion, but when the armistice came, there was no moment to breathe. Administration continued. Trade continued. Military commitments continued. Yet the world around it had changed. The momentum that once felt like strength now felt like strain. Shadows began to stretch across the map, long and quiet at first, then unmistakable. In India, marches, strikes, and organized campaigns challenged British authority. Buildings that had once symbolized control now housed negotiations, petitions, and debate. The call for independence had moved from the margins to the center of public life. Administrators tried to maintain order, but the center of gravity had shifted. Britain responded with laws and reforms, but each decision seemed to reveal more of the pressure beneath the surface. Across the Middle East, agreements made during the war unfolded into responsibilities that could not be easily met. Borders were drawn, mandates established, and governments shaped under international scrutiny. The goal was stability, but the reality was negotiation layered upon negotiation. Every decision carried consequences. Every delay fed frustration. Britain tried to manage competing demands in a region still recovering from conflict. What looked like authority on paper became complexity in practice. In Africa, resistance took many forms. Some movements organized through politics and print. Others emerged in labor disputes, rural uprisings, or calls for representation. People did not always speak with one voice, but their message was clear. They wanted recognition. The Empire's response depended on circumstance, sometimes concessions, sometimes pressure, sometimes promises that would take years to fulfill. The rhythm that had once supported imperial expansion slowed, its pace interrupted by challenge. Economically, the strain deepened. Britain needed to rebuild, but rebuilding required money the war had drained away. The empire had once been described as a source of wealth, but now it demanded resources rather than providing them. Trade slowed. Debt grew. Industries struggled to keep pace with global change. The Great Depression arrived like a tide that washed away confidence. Instead of supporting Britain, the empire began to mirror its instability. Economic hardship at home echoed overseas and returned again, creating a cycle without relief. Public opinion shifted. Some still believed in the empire as a symbol of identity, a connection to the past that offered pride in difficult times. Others saw it as a burden carried too long. Newspapers that once reported victories now printed uncertainty. Politicians debated not only how to preserve the empire, but whether preservation was even possible. The assumptions that had defined the 19th century no longer held shape in the 20th. The Second World War arrived before the empire could recover. Once again, soldiers from across the imperial world fought under the British flag. They crossed deserts, marched through jungles, and defended cities. They protected a system that, in many places, they hoped would change when the war ended. Britain depended on them. Victory required their service. After the war, they expected the recognition of self-determination, not the return of old authority. By the mid-1940s, exhaustion had become a political reality. Britain remained a major power, but one operating at the far edge of its strength. The cost of keeping the empire intact was measured not only in money and manpower, but in credibility. The world was moving toward a different idea of the future. International organizations promoted self-rule. Former colonies spoke in the language of rights rather than obedience. Moments that once confirmed imperial strength now exposed its limitations. In India, independence moved from possibility to certainty. Years of protest, negotiation, and political momentum reached a conclusion. That could no longer be delayed. In 1947, Britain withdrew. The departure marked more than a constitutional change. It revealed the new shape of the world. When one of the largest parts of the empire became independent, everything that remained had to redefine itself. Elsewhere, the realization spread. The empire could no longer be held together simply because it had existed for so long. Britain faced responsibilities that outpaced its resources. It could no longer pause to recover, and that inability to rest became the core of its weakness. A structure that once appeared permanent now seemed temporary. The twilight of empire did not fall suddenly. It crept forward like a slow sunset, not with collapse, but with recognition. For ordinary Britons, the change was emotional as much as political. They had lived with stories of empire since childhood. Maps in classrooms that framed the world from a single point of view. Now they read headlines that contradicted those lessons. The certainty they inherited no longer matched the world outside. The identity that empire had offered began to loosen. Like threads in a fabric worn thin by time. Between 1919 and 1947, the empire continued to function, but its purpose was difficult to define. It still governed, but its authority was questioned. It still traded, but its profits slipped. It still commanded, but its commands were answered with negotiation. What remained was not collapse, but transition. In the end, the empire entered its twilight not through defeat, but through exhaustion. The world required change. And Britain could not rest long enough to resist it. Shadows stretched across the map. Not as darkness, but as the outline of a new era forming. The sunset did not mean the end of Britain. It meant the end of the world it once imagined for itself. This was the moment when the empire's future stopped being a destination. It became a memory, fading at the edges. While a new world waited just beyond the horizon. The end of the endless day 1947 to 1950. The once endless days had finally come to an end, and the world was forever changed. The streets were alive with the hum of activity, as people rushed to and fro, their faces a blur of excitement and trepidation. The headlines screamed of a new era, one where the endless days were finally at an end, and the world was forever changed. Reactions ranged from jubilation to despair, as the news sank in, and the world struggled to come to terms with the new reality. As the news sank in, the man stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the sky, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The world was forever changed, and as the stars twinkled to life in the night sky, a new era dawned, one where the endless days were finally at an end. In 1947, when India achieved independence, it marked more than the end of British rule in a single nation. It marked the moment when an era began to slow. For more than a century, the British Empire had operated like a machine that never stopped. Its production, administration, and military presence functioned across time zones, making night and day feel interchangeable. Goods moved while people slept. Ships crossed oceans while factories burned coal. The empire sustained itself through continuous momentum. But after 1947, the rhythm changed. The first link in the chain had come loose, and others would soon follow. Across the world, headlines announced independence movements, negotiations, and political transitions. In London, the news arrived like a cold breath in the rooms where decisions were once made with confidence. The empire that had stretched across continents now faced something unfamiliar. An ending. People who had grown up with maps shaded in imperial colors saw those colors begin to fade. Not suddenly, but steadily, like paint thinning under rain. In the years after the Second World War, Britain could no longer maintain an empire built on uninterrupted expansion. The war had drained resources, weakened industry, and reshaped global politics. The old systems of control no longer matched the new realities of nationalism, negotiation, and economic strain. Britain faced a choice not between holding the empire or abandoning it, but between accepting change or being overwhelmed by it. The world had turned, and the empire could not turn fast enough to match it. For those living in Britain, the shift was felt quietly at first. Ships still left ports, but fewer returned with the same profitable certainty. Letters from overseas spoke not of new postings and new appointments, but of constitutional conferences, handovers of authority, and the creation of national governments. Offices that once planned future acquisitions now planned withdrawals. The vocabulary of expansion vanished from speeches. In its place came words like transition, partnership, and conclusion. By 1950, the idea of an empire that never slept had become memory rather than reality. The global machine that once powered British identity no longer ran at full force. Trade routes continued, but without the same assumption of control. British officials remained in some regions, but their authority shifted from command to cooperation. Nations that had once been described as possessions were now partners or former territories. The language of ownership dissolved. In Britain, factories still produced goods, but the destinations had changed. Europe and new international partnerships became essential. Railways that once moved materials for imperial trade now carried the weight of domestic recovery. The sense of endless possibility had been replaced by the work of rebuilding. The sunrise and sunset regained their meaning. Night was no longer simply the other half of a working day. It became rest again. For people overseas, the end of empire meant something different. It meant new governments forming, new flags rising, and new voices emerging in parliaments and assemblies. It meant national identity evolving in public for the first time in generations. It meant responsibility, and with responsibility came both celebration and challenge. Independence did not guarantee stability or prosperity, but it guaranteed ownership of the future. That ownership had been denied for so long that its arrival felt like a break in the passage of time. At home, newspapers reflected the shift. Reporters wrote about domestic policy, rationing, reconstruction, and social reform. Debates in Parliament focused on education, healthcare, and employment. The empire was no longer the compass that guided the national agenda. Britain had to navigate without it. There was a kind of uncertainty in that change, but there was also a kind of clarity. The country could no longer look outward for its purpose. It had to look inward. The emotional landscape changed as well. Some people felt relief. They had seen the cost of imperial ambition. Others felt lost or frustrated, convinced that something glorious had been allowed to slip away. They remembered victory parades, royal tours, and maps that seemed to promise permanence. The end of empire did not erase pride. It transformed it. Pride had to be rebuilt on new foundations. Identity shifted between memory and adaptation. Those who had lived and worked abroad returned to Britain with stories of lands that had shaped their lives. They arrived to streets where their experiences felt distant from the concerns of neighbors. They found a nation that knew their past mattered, but did not know what to do with it. Former administrators became teachers or civil servants. Former soldiers returned to factories or shops. Their global experience became part of a national memory rather than a daily function. By 1950, the empire that never slept had slowed enough to feel time passing again. The endless day had ended. The constant expansion that once defined British identity no longer directed the future. The machine had stopped. Not in failure, but in conclusion. The world that Britain helped shape now moved on its own. The end of the endless day did not mean the end of Britain. It meant the end of a world where Britain believed it could command the clock. It meant accepting that history does not pause for those who wish it to remain the same. It meant stepping out of a role that had once felt inevitable. In those quiet years, Britain began learning how to exist without an empire. Not as the center of the world, but as part of it. Thank you for traveling through time today. The British Empire was not only built by force or victory. It was built by movement. By hours, by shifts, by decisions made across oceans. It did not sleep, and that was its strength. It did not sleep, and that was its weakness. Empires rise with momentum. They fall when momentum breaks. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep learning from the past.